Imagine a world teeming with life, a continent at the peak of its population, where the spires of new cathedrals reached for the heavens, and the marketplaces of 1,000 towns and cities buzzed with a vibrant, chaotic energy. This was Europe in the middle of the 14th century, a civilization that, for all its faith, its nascent science, and its burgeoning commerce, believed it stood at the apex of its time. It was a world utterly unprepared for the shadow that was gathering in the east, a shadow that would not just fall upon the land, but seep into its very soil, carried on the backs of the smallest of creatures and in the breath of the dying. This is not merely a story of death, though the death toll is a figure so staggering it defies comprehension. It is the story of a world brought to its knees, a story of how a microscopic organism, an invisible passenger on the arteries of global trade, could shatter empires, rewrite the rules of society, and call into question the very foundations of faith, law, and human decency. This is the story of the great mortality, the great pestilence, known to us today as the Black Death. Over the next 2 hours, we will journey back to this terrified world. We will stand in the besieged city of Caffa as the first plague-ridden bodies are catapulted. Over its walls, we will walk the Silk Road and sail on the Genoese galleys that brought the pestilence to the shores of Europe. We will enter the homes of the sick, listen to the frantic and futile advice of medieval physicians, and witness the desperate acts of both profound piety and abject terror that defined an age. We will explore the science of the bacterium Yersinia, pestis, and understand its terrifying three-pronged attack on the human body. But we will also uncover the incredible stories of survival. We will see how communities fought back, how the human spirit, though battered and broken, endured. We will examine the profound and permanent ways this catastrophe reshaped the Western world, paving the way for the end of feudalism and sowing the seeds of the Renaissance. This is a journey into one of history's darkest chapters, but it is a journey that holds deep and resonant lessons for our own time. Before we begin, I ask you to support our exploration of the past by liking this video and subscribing to the channel. And as we travel through this story, I want you to consider a question. In a world without science, without a true understanding of disease, how would you have reacted? What would you have trusted? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Now, let us turn back the clock. Let us go to the world before the plague, a world of saints and sinners, of famines and feasts, blissfully unaware of the apocalypse that was already sailing towards its shores. To understand the sheer, world-shattering impact of the Black Death, we must first understand the world it was about to decimate. The Europe of 1347 was not an empty, sparse landscape. It was, by its own historical standards, full to bursting. The period from roughly 1000 to 1300 AD is known as the High Middle Ages, a time of remarkable growth and expansion. It was fueled by what historians call the medieval warm period, a spell of several centuries characterized by slightly warmer, more stable weather. This climatic benevolence had a profound effect on the very foundation of medieval life. Agriculture with longer growing seasons and more reliable harvests. The food supply swelled, and with more food came more people. Europe's population exploded, doubling and in some regions even tripling. By the dawn of the 14th century, the continent was home to an estimated 75 to 80 million people, a number it had never before supported. This demographic boom was the engine of medieval dynamism. It built the great Gothic cathedrals like Chartres and Notre Dame, whose soaring vaults were a testament to both divine faith and human ambition. It fueled the Crusades' vast military and spiritual enterprises that sent hundreds of thousands of Europeans across the known world. It swelled the ranks of new towns and cities, which wrestled for charters and freedoms from old feudal lords. The marketplaces of Venice, Genoa, Bruges, and London became vibrant nexuses of international trade, connecting the wool of England with the silks of the Orient. This was a confident, expanding, and interconnected world, but this vitality masked a deep and growing fragility. The very success of the High Middle Ages had created a system living on a knife's edge. The population had grown so immense that it was pressing hard against the limits of its environment and technology. For centuries, Europeans had been clearing forests, draining marshes, and cultivating new land to feed the ever-increasing number of mouths. By 1300, this expansion had reached its limit. Farmers were now plowing marginal lands' rocky hillsides, thin soil, and cold uplands that were far less productive and highly susceptible to failure. The delicate balance between population and food supply was becoming dangerously precarious. The system had no slack, no surplus to absorb a shock, and then the shock came. The clement weather of the medieval warm period began to falter. The early 14th century saw the onset of what is now known as the Little Ice Age, a period of climatic cooling and instability that would last for centuries. The change was not dramatic overnight, but its effects were catastrophic. The years 1315 to 1317 were ones of biblical misery. A period of relentless year-round rain led to crop failures on an unprecedented scale. This was the great famine. The chronicles of the time paint a harrowing picture. Grain rotted in the fields. Livestock without fodder sickened and died. The price of what little food was available skyrocketed beyond the reach of the common person. Starvation was not a threat. It was a grim daily reality. The Irish annals record people digging up the graves of the recently buried for food. Chroniclers across the continent speak of cannibalism, of parents abandoning children they could not feed, and of widespread, debilitating hunger that left millions dead and millions more severely weakened. The Great Famine was a brutal lesson in the fragility of life. It was in many ways a dress rehearsal for apocalypse. It left the European population traumatized and, crucially, immunologically compromised. An entire generation grew up malnourished, their bodies less capable of fighting off infection. The continent had survived, but it was scarred, hungry, and vulnerable. As the continent recovered, its fundamental structures remained. Society was a rigid pyramid. At the top were the nobility and the high clergy, the 1% who controlled the land, the wealth, and the power. They were the first estate, those who prayed, and the second estate, those who fought. Below them, constituting the vast majority, over 90%, was the third estate, those who worked. This was a world of serfs tied to the land, of peasants who owed their labor and their loyalty to a local lord in exchange for a small plot to farm and a promise of protection. It was a system built on obligation and hierarchy, a divine order that had seemed eternal and unchangeable for centuries. The spiritual life of this world was dominated by a single, monolithic institution, the Catholic Church. The Church was not just a place of worship. It was the government, the social safety net, the primary patron of art and education, and the ultimate arbiter of truth. Its authority was absolute. The Pope in Rome was Christ's vicar on earth, and the local parish priest was the most important figure in any village, guiding his flock from baptism to the grave. The rhythms of life were dictated by the liturgical calendar, a cycle of feast days and fasts. The promise of heaven and the terror of hell were not abstract concepts. They were palpable certainties that shaped every aspect of human behavior. Sin was real, demons were a constant threat, and God's wrath was a direct and terrifying force in the world. When disaster struck, there was only one conceivable explanation. It was a punishment from a displeased God for the sins of mankind. And what of the world of medicine? To a modern mind, 14th century medicine is a landscape of profound ignorance, superstition, and well-intentioned, but often lethal practice. The dominant medical theory, inherited from the ancient Greeks Hippocrates and Galen, was that of the four humors. The human body was believed to contain four essential fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Each was associated with an element: air, water, fire, earth, and a quality: hot and wet, cold and wet, hot and dry, cold and dry. Health was the result of these four humors being in perfect balance. Sickness, therefore, was caused by an imbalance, an excess or a deficiency of one of the humors. The entire diagnostic and therapeutic framework was built on this idea. A physician's job was to identify the imbalance and correct it. If a patient had a fever, they were considered to have an excess of blood, which was a hot and wet humor. The logical treatment was to remove the excess through bloodletting, either by opening a vein with a flame or by applying leeches. Other treatments aimed at purging the body to restore balance included prescribing emetics to induce vomiting or laxatives to empty the bowels. The air itself was a source of concern. The theory of miasma, literally bad air, posited that disease was carried in foul-smelling, corrupt air emanating from rotting organic matter, swamps, or even from certain astrological conjunctions. Remedies often involved carrying sweet-smelling flowers or pomanders filled with aromatic herbs to create a protective bubble of good air around oneself. The physicians of the time were not fools. They were learned men trained in the great universities of Padua, Bologna, and Paris. They studied the classical texts and debated their finer points with intellectual rigor. But their entire paradigm was fundamentally wrong. They had no concept of germ theory, no understanding of bacteria or viruses. They could not see the microscopic world, and so they could not conceive of an enemy they could not see. Their diagnostic tools were limited to observing the patient's complexion, taking their pulse, and most importantly, inspecting the color, consistency, and even the taste of their urine. The uroscopy flask, a clear glass vessel in which a patient's urine was held up to the light, was the quintessential symbol of the medieval Dr. Dot. This was the state of the world's most advanced medicine. It was a system entirely unequipped to deal with a minor infection, let alone a virulent, fast-acting pathogen like Yersinia pestis. When the Black Death arrived, these physicians, with their lancets, Their charts of the zodiac and their flasks of urine would stand before a biological firestorm with nothing but theories and prayers. Their confidence and the confidence of the people in them would be shattered dot. So let us paint the final picture of this world on the eve of its greatest trial. It is a world of deep and fervent faith, yet one where the population is physically weakened by recent famine. It is a society with a rigid, seemingly unbreakable social structure, yet one whose very population density in crowded, unsanitary towns makes it a perfect breeding ground for disease. It is a continent interconnected by burgeoning trade routes that move goods, ideas, and people with unprecedented efficiency. But these same routes would soon become the superhighways for a killer. It is a civilization that possesses a formal, scholarly system of medicine, yet one that is based on a complete misunderstanding of the nature of illness. This was Europe in 1347. It was prosperous, pious, and populous, and it was a tinderbox, waiting for a spark. That spark had been ignited years before and thousands of miles away in the arid steppes of Central Asia, and now, carried in the blood of fleas, on the backs of rats, nestled in the cargo holds of merchant ships, the flame was drawing inexorably closer. The greatest catastrophe in recorded history was about to begin. Oh, find the origin of the great European catastrophe of 1347. We must leave Europe entirely. We must travel backwards in time and eastwards in geography, leaving behind the green fields and burgeoning cities of the West for a landscape altogether different. Our journey takes us to the immense arid heart of the Eurasian landmass, to the vast and unforgiving steppe grasslands and deserts of Central Asia. It is here, in a world far from the awareness of any European king or pope, in the silent ancient cycles of the natural world, that the fuse of the Black Death was lit. The story of the plague does not begin with humans. It begins with a bacterium, a rodent, and a flea. The true agent of the Black Death, the invisible killer, is a microscopic, rod-shaped bacterium named Yersinia pestis. It is an organism of terrifying efficiency, a master of survival and transmission. But for most of its existence, Yersinia pestis has little to do with mankind. Its natural home is what scientists call a sylvatic or wild plague reservoir. For countless centuries, the bacterium has existed in a relatively stable cycle among populations of wild rodents across the globe, particularly in the vast, dry plains of Central Asia. The primary hosts in this region are creatures like the great gerbil, or, most famously, the marmot, a large ground squirrel well adapted to the harsh climate. These rodent populations are the bacterium's permanent home. The disease circulates amongst them, carried by their ectoparasites, their fleas. The relationship is a finely tuned, deadly dance. A flea, often of the species Synopsilochiopus, bites an infected rodent and ingests the Yersinia pestis bacteria along with the animal's blood. Inside the flea's gut, the bacterium performs a sinister trick. It multiplies rapidly, forming a thick biofilm that blocks the flea's proventriculus, a valve leading to its stomach. The flea is now blocked. It is ravenously hungry, as no new blood can reach its stomach, but it cannot feed properly. In its desperate, starving state, it hops from host to host, attempting to feed again and again. When it bites a new animal, it cannot draw blood in. Instead, it regurgitates its last blood meal, now teeming with thousands of Yersinia pestis bacteria, directly into the bite wound. The new host is now infected, and the cycle continues in its natural reservoir. This system can remain stable. For long periods, the rodents have, over millennia, developed a degree of resistance. The plague might cause localized die-offs, but the overall host population survives, and the bacterium survives with it. The world is in balance. But this balance is fragile. It can be shattered by external shocks, and in the early 14th century, a series of shocks occurred. Climatologists studying tree rings and ice cores have suggested that the climate of Central Asia underwent a dramatic shift in the 1320s and 1330s. A period of unusual weather, perhaps rapid warming followed by cold and excessive rain, could have had a cascade of effects. It may have led to a boom in the rodent population, followed by a sudden crash as their food sources disappeared. Or it could have stressed the animals, making them more susceptible to the disease. Whatever the precise cause, the ancient equilibrium was broken. The plague began to spread with unusual virulence among the wild rodent populations. As their primary hosts died off in massive numbers, the infected and starving fleas were faced with an existential crisis. They needed new hosts. They began to seek out other mammals, creatures that were not their usual targets. They found them in the animals that lived in close proximity to the wild rodents and to humans: camels, livestock, and most critically, the common black rat, Rattus rattus. This was the species that lived in human settlements, in the walls of their homes, in the storage sheds for their grain, and most importantly, in the cargo holds of their ships and the saddlebags of their caravans. The black rat was the perfect vehicle, the biological bridge, to bring Yersinia pestis out of its isolated wilderness reservoir and into the world of humankind. This ecological event, this spillover, might have remained a localized tragedy were it not for another uniquely human factor, the Mongol Empire. In the 13th century, the conquests of Genghis Khan and his successors had forged the largest contiguous land empire in history, stretching from the Pacific Ocean to the borders of Europe. By the 14th century, while the empire had fractured into several successor khanates, it still enforced a relative stability over a vast territory. This era, known as the Pax Mongolica, or Mongol Peace, had a profound and unintended consequence. For the first time, it secured and regularized the ancient network of trade routes that crisscrossed Eurasia, known collectively as the Silk Road. The Silk Road was not a single road, but a sprawling artery of commerce and connection. From cities like Samarkand and Bukhara, caravans of merchants, guarded by Mongol patrols, transported silk, spices, porcelain, and other precious goods from the east to the west. Ideas, technologies, and religions traveled with them. But now so did disease. The newly infected populations of black rats and the fleas they carried found a perfect transport system. They nestled into the bales of silk, the sacks of grain, and the personal belongings of the merchants themselves. As the caravans moved, slowly but steadily from one oasis town to the next, they carried the plague with them, seeding new infections at every stop. The Silk Road had become a superhighway for Yersinia pestis. The first whispers of the coming storm, the first pieces of hard evidence of the plague's westward march, are found in a remote and unexpected place, a community of Nestorian Christians living near Lake Issyk-Kul in modern-day Kyrgyzstan. Archaeological investigations of their cemeteries have revealed a startling spike in mortality in the years 1338 and 1339. The tombstones, inscribed in Syriac script, give a clear and chilling cause of death. They read, "This is the grave of who died of pestilence." Here, nearly a decade before the plague would touch the shores of the Mediterranean, we find its signature, a clear sign that a devastating epidemic was sweeping through the region. This was the vanguard of the Black Death. From these Central Asian heartlands, the pestilence radiated outwards. One arm of its advance pushed south into China and India, where it caused immense devastation, though records are more fragmented. The other arm, the one that would change the course of Western history, continued its inexorable creep westward. It followed the trade routes, moving with the rhythm of the caravans, across Persia and Mesopotamia. By the early 1340s, it had reached the Caucasus region and the great trading cities of the Middle East, like Baghdad and Damascus. In 1346, it arrived in the territory of the Golden Horde, the Mongol Khanate that controlled the vast steppes of what is now southern Russia and Ukraine. It had reached the northern shores of the Black Sea. The Black Sea was the critical interface between the Mongol world and the European one. Its port cities were vibrant melting pots, where the goods of the East were transferred to the ships of the West. The most important of these was the city of Caffa on the Crimean Peninsula, a heavily fortified and phenomenally wealthy colony. Controlled by the Italian Maritime Republic of Genoa, Caffa was Europe's window to the Silk Road. It was a place of immense strategic and commercial importance, a jewel that the Genoese were determined to protect, and their rivals, the Mongols of the Golden Horde, were eager to control Dot by 1346. The bacterium Yersinia pestis, having completed a journey of thousands of miles in several decades, had arrived at the gates of Europe. It had spilled over from its natural hosts, found a vehicle in the black rat, and traveled the arteries of human commerce. It had left a trail of death across Asia, and was now raging through the armies of the Golden Horde. The world of Europe, populous, prosperous, and utterly oblivious, continued its daily life, unaware that its greatest enemy was gathering its strength just across the water. The stage was now set for the single event that would definitively transmit the apocalypse. From the land of the Mongols to the world of Christendom, the siege of Caffa was about to begin. The city of Caffa, in the mid-1340s, stood as a monument to the power and ambition of the Italian maritime republics. Perched on the southern coast of the Crimean Peninsula, it was a fortified enclave of Christian Europe thrust deep into the territory of the Mongol Golden Horde. For the Republic of Genoa, Caffa was more than a colony. It was the golden nail that fastened the commerce of the East to the markets of the West. Through its bustling harbor passed silks from China, spices from India, and furs from the Russian north, all destined for the wealthy consumers of Italy, France, and beyond. The city's warehouses bulged with goods, its churches were rich with tithes, and its formidable stone walls, manned by Genoese crossbowmen, stood as a defiant symbol of commercial might and religious identity in a foreign land. It was a city that oozed wealth, and wealth invites conflict. The relationship between the Genoese traders and their Mongol overlords had always been a tense dance of mutual benefit and simmering hostility. The Italians paid for the privilege of trading, and the khans of the Golden Horde grew rich from the tariffs. But cultural and religious friction was constant. A street brawl, a dispute over prices, or an act of perceived disrespect could easily spiral into a diplomatic crisis. In 1343, a clash between Christians and Muslims in the nearby city of Tana had escalated, leading the reigning Khan, Johnny Beg, to assert his authority. He laid siege to Caffa, determined to expel the arrogant and avaricious Italians once and for all. This initial siege faltered, but by 1346, Johnny Beg had returned with a vast, formidable Mongol army, bent on breaking the city's defenses. The siege that commenced in 1346 was a brutal, grinding affair typical of medieval warfare. Johnny Beg's forces surrounded the city, cutting off all land-based reinforcement and supply. The Mongols, masters of siegecraft learned over a century of conquests, constructed massive siege engines, trebuchets, and catapults capable of hurling enormous stones against and over the city's walls. Day after day, the defenders of Caffa were subjected to a relentless bombardment. The sound of war became the sound of daily life, the creak and groan of the siege engines, the whistle of projectiles through the air, and the crash of stone on stone, punctuated by the cries of the wounded. Inside the walls, the Genoese and their local allies held firm. Their own defenses were strong. Their supplies were adequate as long as their sea lanes remained open, and their crossbowmen were more than a match for the Mongol archers. They settled in for a long, arduous, but conventional siege, confident in their walls and their connection to the sea. But in the latter part of 1346, a new and terrifying enemy appeared in the Mongol camp. It was an enemy against which their horsemen, archers, and siege engines were utterly useless. The pestilence, which had been marching with them from the east, now erupted with explosive force among the besieging army. The chronicler Gabriel de Musi, though his account is likely a second-hand dramatization written from Italy, captures the essence of the horror. He wrote that the plague slew thousands and thousands every day. The Mongol soldiers, once a picture of terrifying martial strength, were reduced to shivering, feverish wrecks. They were afflicted with sudden swellings in their groins and armpits, followed by a swift and agonizing death. The once organized and disciplined siege camp became a sprawling infirmary of the dying. The stench of death hung heavy in the air, and morale collapsed. The mighty Golden Horde was being destroyed from within by an invisible foe. Johnny Beg watched as his army disintegrated. Victory through conventional means was now impossible. His soldiers were dying faster than the Genoese defenders ever could. In this moment of utter desperation, faced with the ruin of his campaign, the Khan made a decision of breathtaking cruelty and ingenuity. It was an act that would transform the siege of Caffa from a regional conflict into a world historical event. If his army was to be consumed by this pestilence, he would make it a weapon. He would give this foul disease to his enemies. He gave the order. The Mongol soldiers collected the bodies of their comrades who had succumbed to the plague. These corpses, swollen, blackened, and reeking of decay, were hoisted onto the giant throwing arms of the trebuchets. The Genoese defenders on the walls watched in stunned disbelief. The bombardment of stones had ceased, and now a new, grotesque form of ammunition was being loaded. With a great groan of twisted ropes and counterweights, the arms of the siege, engines swung upwards, and the plague-ridden bodies were launched into the sky. They tumbled end over end, grotesque arcs of death against the clouds, before crashing down within the city walls, smashing onto rooftops or landing with a sickening thud in the narrow streets and squares. The psychological impact on the defenders was immediate and profound. It was an act of warfare so ghoulish, so far beyond the recognized norms of conflict, that it felt like an assault from hell itself. The Genoese frantically tried to deal with the macabre projectiles, dragging the corpses away and dumping them into the sea. But the damage was already done. It is unlikely that the corpses themselves were the primary vector of infection. Rather, the city was already infested with its own population of rats. It would only have taken a few infected rats or fleas to arrive with the Mongol army or their supplies to begin the chain of transmission. But to the people of Caffa, the connection was direct and terrifying. The Mongols had hurled death over their walls, and now death was beginning to stalk their streets. Soon, the same mysterious illness that had ravaged the Mongol camp began to appear within the city. A citizen would be struck with a sudden fever. Within hours, the telltale swellings of buboes would appear. Then came the delirium, the pain, and in a matter of days, death. The disease spread with terrifying speed through the densely packed city. The Genoese were trapped. Their stone walls, once their salvation, had become their tomb. The enemy was no longer outside the gates, but inside every home, every alleyway. The city's physicians were helpless, their remedies useless. Panic and despair replaced grim determination. The siege was effectively over, but there was no victor. Both the besiegers and the besieged were being annihilated by a common, invisible enemy. For the surviving Genoese merchants, there was only one option left: flight. Their great trading post was lost, not to Mongol swords, but to a pestilence that seemed to be a manifestation of God's wrath. They had to escape. In the early days of 1347, those who were still healthy enough to move scrambled to their galleys in the harbor. They loaded what little cargo they could and prepared to abandon the dying city. It was a desperate exodus, a fleet of fugitives leaving a scene of apocalyptic horror. We cannot know for certain what was in their minds, but we can imagine their relief as they hoisted their sails, caught the winds of the Black Sea, and saw the cursed walls of Caffa shrink behind them. They were heading west, back home to Italy, to the safety of Christendom. They did not know, could not have known, that they were not fleeing the plague. They were carrying it with them, nestled deep within the holds of their ships, in the coils of rope, in the sacks of grain, and in the weave of the textiles, were the true conquerors of Caffa, the black rats and their cargo of infected fleas. The Genoese galleys, scudding across the waves toward Constantinople, Messina, and Genoa, had become floating vessels of doom. They were the patient zeros of Europe. The act of biological warfare at Caffa had succeeded beyond Johnny Beg's wildest imaginings. It had not just broken a city, it had broken a continent. The apocalypse had set sail. The journey of the Genoese galleys westward from Caffa was a voyage through the mouth of hell. The cramped, enclosed space of a 14th century ship was a perfect incubator for the pestilence they carried. Below decks in the dark, warm cargo hold, the infected rats multiplied and died, and their fleas, their hosts gone, sought out new sources of blood. They found it in the sailors and merchants who manned the ships. One by one, the crew began to fall ill. The initial relief of escaping, Caffa curdled into a new, more intimate terror. There was nowhere to run. The fevers, the chills, the agonizing buboes, the entire nightmare of Caffa was being replayed in the claustrophobic confines of these ships at sea. Men who had set sail with dreams of returning home to their families now lay dying on the hard. Wooden planks, their groans lost to the sound of the wind and waves dot in October of 1347. A convoy of 12 of these Genoese death ships, as they would come to be known, appeared on the horizon off the coast of Sicily. They made for the bustling, prosperous port of Messina, one of the island's most important commercial centers. To the watchers on the shore, the approach of trading galleys was a normal, welcome sight, a sign of prosperity and connection to the wider world. But as the ships drew closer and entered the harbor, it became clear that something was terribly wrong. There was an eerie lack of activity on the decks. The sails were handled clumsily. Hails from the shore were met with weak cries or, in some cases, silence. When the ships finally docked and the local port officials and merchants went aboard, they were met with a scene of unimaginable horror. The sight was recorded for posterity by a Franciscan friar named Michael of Piazza, whose chronicle provides one of the most vivid and immediate accounts of the plague's arrival. He wrote that the Genoese ships carried with them a disease in their bones. The decks were littered with the dead and the dying. The few sailors still able to stand were spectral figures, racked with fever, stumbling, and delirious. Their bodies were covered in the terrifying signature of the illness, sickness clinging to their very bones, and they had black swellings in their groin or armpits that oozed blood and pus. The stench of sickness and death was overwhelming. The people of Messina reacted with a mixture of horror and pity. They had never seen an illness like this, one so swift, so virulent, so grotesque, it defied all known categories of disease. The city's authorities, grasping the scale of the disaster and the danger it posed, acted with a decisiveness born of terror. They immediately placed the Genoese sailors under a strict quarantine and ordered the fleet of death ships to leave the harbor at once. But it was already far, far too late. The brief time the ships had been moored at the dock had been enough. The invisible passengers had already the true agents of transmission. The black rats were agile and opportunistic. They were climbers, capable of running along the thick mooring ropes that tied the ships to the docks. Before the ships could be cast out, a sufficient number of them had scurried ashore, carrying their deadly cargo of fleas, and vanished into the labyrinthine alleys and crowded tenements of Messina. They found a paradise. Medieval cities were a perfect environment for rats, narrow streets filled with garbage and human waste, wooden buildings with plentiful spaces to hide, and granaries overflowing with food. The rat population of Messina soon had its own epidemic of plague, and as they died, their fleas sought warmth and blood from the nearest mammal, the human inhabitants of the city. Within days of the ship's departure, the first citizens of Messina began to fall ill. The symptoms were terrifyingly familiar. A man would feel perfectly healthy at sunrise, Be struck by a sudden fever and aches by midday. Discover the agonizing, growing bubo by evening, and be dead within 3 to 5 days. The disease ripped through the city with the speed of a firestorm. Michael of Piazza described the utter panic that ensued. Realizing that this sudden death was coming to them, he wrote, "The people of Messina fled." But it was not just the sick who were thrown out, but also many who were healthy in their terror. The social fabric of the city dissolved. People shut themselves in their homes. Family members seeing the first signs of the sickness in a loved one would abandon them to their fate, fleeing to save themselves. Thus, Piazza wrote, fathers abandoned their sick sons. Lawyers refused to draw up wills for the dying. Friars and nuns were left to care for the sick, and priests to hear their confessions, but they too were struck down. The flight from Messina, intended as an act of self-preservation, became the primary mechanism for the plague's spread across the island of Sicily. Terrified refugees carrying the disease, either in their own bodies or in their belongings, streamed out of the city and into the surrounding countryside and other towns. They sought refuge in the city of Catania, only to bring the pestilence with them, which then devastated that city in turn. By the end of 1347, the entire island of Sicily was engulfed in the great mortality. Meanwhile, the expelled death ships from Messina and other fugitive vessels from Caffa and the east continued their journey, seeding the plague at every port of call. In November 1347, a ship carrying the disease arrived in the great French port of Marseille, igniting a new firestorm on the European mainland. Around the same time, in January 1348, the plague arrived in the great maritime republics of Italy. That had, ironically, done so much to create the commercial world that was now spreading their doom. A ship from the east brought the pestilence to Genoa, with the very home of the merchants from Caffa. The Genoese, hearing of the horror, tried to drive the ship away with burning arrows, but again it was too late. Venice, Genoa's great rival and the other nexus of eastern trade, was also struck. Its crowded canals and islands became a death trap, with the plague spreading so rapidly that the city's elaborate funeral rites collapsed into a desperate routine of collecting and disposing of corpses. From these major ports, Messina, Genoa, Venice, Marseille, the Black Death began its conquest of Europe. It moved with the speed of trade and travel. It moved inland from the ports, following the rivers and the roads. It was carried by merchants to inland fairs, by soldiers returning from campaigns, by pilgrims on their way to shrines, by beggars moving from town to town. By the spring of 1348, it had consumed most of Italy, including the great city of Florence, where it would inspire Giovanni Boccaccio to write his masterpiece, the Decameron. It had pushed deep into France, marching up the Rhone Valley towards Paris. It had crossed the Adriatic Sea to infect the Balkans. A separate maritime arrival brought it to the Iberian Peninsula, to modern-day Spain and Portugal. Europe, a continent at the height of its population, interconnected by a dense network of trade, travel, and faith, was utterly unprepared. Its people watched in horror as this new, inexplicable pestilence advanced on them, a relentless, unstoppable tide of death that had begun just a few months before with the arrival of 12 ships in a Sicilian harbor. The patient zeros of Europe had fulfilled their terrible destiny. The continent was now caught in the grip of a monster with three distinct and terrifying faces. Oh, the terrified populace of the 14th century. The plague was a single monstrous entity, a divine scourge sent to punish a sinful world. It was the pestilence, the great mortality. They could only describe it by its outward signs: the sudden fever, the telltale swellings, the swift and almost certain death. They could not know that the enemy they faced was not one single illness, but a devious and multifaceted pathogen, a biological predator that attacked the human body in three distinct and horrifying ways. The bacterium Yersinia pestis presented itself in three clinical forms: bubonic, pneumonic, and septicemic, each with its own method of transmission, its own terrifying symptoms, and its own staggering mortality rate. To truly understand the horror of the Black Death, we must dissect this three-faced monster and gaze upon each of its visages in turn. The first and most common face of the plague was the bubonic form. This was the classic presentation of the disease, the one that gave the Black Death its name. The infection began with the bite of an infected flea. For 3 to 8 days, the victim might feel perfectly normal, entirely unaware of the bacterial army multiplying within their body. The bacteria would travel from the site of the bite through the lymphatic system, the body's network for draining fluids and fighting infection. Their target was the first lymph node they encountered. Once there, they would launch a ferocious assault, triggering a massive and desperate inflammatory response from the body's immune system. The result was the defining symptom of the plague, the bubo. The infected lymph node would swell at an alarming rate, becoming a hard, tense, and excruciatingly painful lump, depending on the location of the flea bite. These buboes would typically appear in the groin, the armpits, or on the neck. They could grow to the size of a chicken's egg or even an orange. The pain was described as a constant burning agony. As the bacteria overwhelmed the node, the tissue would begin to die from the inside out, a process called necrosis. The blood vessels within the node would hemorrhage, filling it with dark, decomposed blood. This would cause the overlying skin to turn a dark purple or black color. It is from these blackened, deathly swellings that the plague received its most enduring and terrifying moniker, the Black Death. The appearance of the bubo was accompanied by a host of other debilitating symptoms. The victim would be seized by a high fever, often reaching 40 degrees Celsius or 104 degrees Fahrenheit. This was accompanied by violent chills and uncontrollable shaking. Extreme fatigue and weakness would render them bedridden. They would suffer from severe headaches, vomiting, and an intense sensitivity to light. As the infection progressed, many would experience neurological symptoms, falling into a state of delirium or a heavy stupor, from which they could not be easily roused. For those with bubonic plague, the prognosis was grim. Without modern medical treatment, the mortality rate is estimated to have been between 40 and 70%. From the appearance of the first symptom, death, usually from organ failure and toxic shock, would typically follow within 3 to 5 agonizing days. This was the monster's primary form, a horrifying ordeal delivered by the bite of an insect. But it was not its deadliest dot. The second face of the plague was the pneumonic form. This occurred when the Yersinia pestis bacteria managed to lodge themselves in a person's lungs, This could happen in two ways. It could be a secondary infection where a person already suffering from the bubonic form would have the bacteria spread from their lymphatic system to their lungs via the bloodstream. But more terrifyingly, it could also be a primary infection. A person with secondary pneumonic plague would have a severe fluid-filled cough. Each time they coughed, they would expel a fine aerosol of microscopic droplets teeming with Yersinia pestis bacteria. Any healthy person who inhaled these droplets could become infected directly in their lungs, bypassing the flea and the bubo stage entirely. This changed the rules of the game completely. The plague was no longer just a disease of rats and fleas. It was now a disease that could leap directly from person to person through the very air they breathed. In the crowded, poorly ventilated homes and hovels of medieval Europe, this made the disease infinitely more contagious, especially during the colder winter months when people huddled together indoors. The symptoms of pneumonic plague were even more horrific than the bubonic form. The onset was rapid, often within a single day of exposure. It began with a high fever, a racing pulse, and difficulty breathing. Soon a racking cough would develop, producing a thin, watery sputum that was initially white, but soon became streaked with blood. As the lungs filled with fluid and hemorrhaged, the victim would essentially drown in their own blood, coughing up a frothy, bright red discharge. The terror of the pneumonic form was its speed and its lethality. There were no buboes to serve. As a warning sign, it was a swift, brutal assault on the respiratory system. The Welsh poet Iwan Gethin, who witnessed it firsthand before dying of it himself, wrote a chilling description. We see death coming into our midst like black smoke, a plague which cuts off the young, a ruthless phantom which has no mercy for. Fair countenance, ... It is of the form of a vile death struggle, a lodging for the chest, a painful swelling of the breath, a bubbling up and a grievous labor. For those who contracted pneumonic plague, there was almost no hope. The mortality rate is believed to have been between 95 and 100%. Death was almost certain, and it came with terrifying speed, often within 24 to 48 hours of the first cough. This was the form of the plague that allowed it to spread with such explosive, unstoppable force through the human population. The third and final phase of the monster was the septicemic plague. This was the rarest, swiftest, and most deadly form of all. Septicemic plague occurred when the Yersinia pestis bacteria did not localize in a lymph node or the lungs, but instead invaded the bloodstream directly and began to multiply there at a ferocious rate. This could happen from a flea bite, but it was essentially a state of overwhelming systemic infection. The body's circulatory system, the river of life, became a highway for the bacteria. The symptoms of septicemic plague were shocking and dramatic. The victim would be struck down with an extremely high fever, chills, and profound weakness. But the most terrifying sign was what the bacteria did to the blood itself. Yersinia pestis produces toxins that cause a condition known as disseminated intravascular coagulation, or DIC. This is a pathological disruption of the body's clotting mechanisms. Tiny blood clots form throughout the body, blocking blood flow to small vessels. At the same time, the body's clotting factors are used up, leading to spontaneous and uncontrollable bleeding. The result was visible on the scan. The victim's body would become covered in dark purple or black spots as blood leaked from the vessels into the skin. This widespread subcutaneous bleeding is another possible origin for the name Black Death. The tips of the fingers, toes, and the nose would often turn black as the tissue died from lack of blood flow. The horror of septicemic plague was its sheer speed. It killed so rapidly that the body often did not even have time to form the characteristic buboes of the bubonic form. It was not uncommon for a person to feel well in the morning, fall ill around noon, and be dead by nightfall. Contemporary accounts are filled with stories of people who went to bed healthy and were found dead in the morning, their bodies already blackened by the effects of the disease. The mortality rate for untreated septicemic plague was, and still is, effectively 100%. There was no defense, no time to react. It was a biological firestorm that consumed its victims in a matter of hours. These, then, were the three faces of the monster that laid siege to 14th century Europe. A disease delivered by flea bite that attacked the lymph nodes. A disease delivered by breath that attacked the lungs, and a disease that turned the very blood to poison. A single bacterium was responsible for all three, and a single victim could even suffer from all three at once. Faced with this multifaceted and utterly bewildering enemy, the physicians of the age, armed with their ancient theories and their well-intentioned but useless remedies, prepared to do battle. It would be a battle they were destined to lose. In the face of the three-faced monster, the terrified populace of Europe turned to the only authorities they knew, their priests and their physicians. While the priests offered prayers and explanations of divine wrath, it was the physicians who were expected to provide practical aid, to understand the mechanism of the disease, and offer some hope of a cure. The university-trained doctor of the 14th century was a respected figure, a man of learning who had studied the great medical texts of the ancient world, particularly the works of the Greek physicians Hippocrates and Galen as filtered through the great Arab scholars like Avicenna. They possessed a complex and intellectually coherent system for understanding the human body and its ailments. The catastrophic tragedy of the Black Death was that this entire system, built over 1,000 years of scholarship, was fundamentally, catastrophically wrong. The bedrock of medieval medicine was the theory of the four humors, as we have touched upon. This theory posited that the body was composed of four essential liquids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Each humor corresponded to an element, a season, and a set of qualities. A healthy person was one in whom these four humors were in perfect balance. Sickness was, therefore, always the result of an imbalance, an excess, or a deficiency of one humor. The plague, with its high fevers and inflamed buboes, was almost universally diagnosed as a disease of excess blood, a humor considered naturally hot and wet. The patient was, in the view of the physician, literally boiling over with a corrupt and superabundant humor. The second major theory at play was that of miasma. This was the belief that disease was carried by bad air, a poisonous, corrupt vapor that emanated from rotting organic matter, stagnant water, swamps, or even from the unwholesome alignment of planets. The Italian scholar Gentile da Foligno, a celebrated professor at the University of Padua, wrote one of the most influential treatises on the plague. He argued that a fatal conjunction of Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn had caused a great pestilence. In the air, a corrupt vapor that, when inhaled, would travel to the heart and corrupt the life spirit. This miasmatic air could become trapped in certain localities, explaining why some towns were hit harder than others. Armed with these two theories, humoral imbalance and miasma, the physicians of Europe launched their counterattack against the plague. Their intentions were noble, their efforts tireless, but their treatments were not only ineffective, they were often actively harmful. The entire therapeutic strategy revolved around two goals: rebalancing the humors and protecting oneself from the bad air. The primary method for correcting the diagnosed excess of hot, corrupt blood was bloodletting. This was the cornerstone of academic medical practice. A physician, or more often a barber surgeon under his direction, would open a vein, typically in the arm with a sharp instrument called a phleem, and drain a prescribed amount of blood into a bowl. The amount was carefully calculated based on the patient's age, complexion, the time of year, and the alignment of the stars. The goal was to remove the peccant, or sinful, matter and allow the body to return to equilibrium. For patients suffering from a disease that was already causing massive fluid loss, shock, and organ failure, draining their blood was one of the worst things one could possibly do. It weakened them further, accelerated their decline, and likely increased the death rate substantially. Another method of bloodletting involved the use of leeches, which were applied to the skin, often directly on or near the buboes themselves, in the belief that they would draw out the poison dot beyond bleeding. The other main strategy was to purge the body of its corrupt humors through other means. Patients were given powerful emetics, concoctions of herbs like hellebore, to induce violent vomiting. They were prescribed strong laxatives and diuretics to empty their bowels and bladder. The goal was a complete and forceful evacuation of the body's contents. Again, for a patient already severely dehydrated by fever and vomiting, these prescribed purges were often a death sentence. The lancing of the buboes themselves was a common and intensely painful procedure. Believing the swellings to be a concentration of the plague's poison, physicians would cut them open with a knife to allow the venom to drain out. To encourage this draining, they would apply poultices made of ingredients like figs cooked, onions, or even pigeon dung, believing these substances had the power to draw out the evil. While releasing the pus might have offered some minor, temporary relief in a few cases, the open wound created a new site for secondary bacterial infections, and the direct contact with the pus, which was teeming with Yersinia pestis, put the physician or caregiver at extreme risk of contracting the disease themselves. On the preventative front, the fight was against the invisible miasma. Public health measures ordered by town councils on the advice of physicians focused on cleaning the air. Large bonfires of aromatic woods, like pine or juniper, were lit in public squares. Church bells were rung constantly, not just to call people to prayer, but in the belief that the vibrations of the sound would help to break up and disperse the poisonous vapors. In homes, people burned incense, boiled vinegar, or scattered fragrant herbs and flowers like rosemary and lavender to purify the air in their rooms. Individuals were advised to carry their own personal protection against miasma. The wealthy would carry a pomander, a small metal ball filled with ambergris, musk, or other expensive aromatic resins, which they would hold to their nose when walking outdoors or near the sick. The less fortunate simply carried a posy of flowers. Personal behavior was also strictly regulated based on medical advice. Physicians warned against bathing, as it was believed that warm water would open the pores of the skin, making one more vulnerable to the miasma seeping in. They prescribed complex diets, advising people to avoid foods that were considered hot and moist, like certain fish and dairy products, and to instead consume things considered cold and dry, like sour fruits. They even offered advice on one's emotional state, warning that emotions like fear, sadness, or even joy could alter the body's humoral balance and make one susceptible. The ideal was a state of calm moderation, a difficult prescription in the midst of an apocalypse. The most famous image associated with medicine during the plague, that of the plague doctor in a long coat, gloves, and a terrifying beaked mask, is something of an anachronism. This specific costume was largely developed and standardized for later outbreaks in the 17th century. However, the principle behind it was born in the Black Death. The beak of the mask was designed to be stuffed with aromatic herbs, vinegar-soaked, sponges, or other sweet-smelling substances, acting as a personal respirator to filter out the deadly miasma. It was a physical manifestation of the dominant medical theory of the age dot. As the death toll mounted relentlessly, it became terrifyingly clear that the learned physicians, with all their Galenic theories, their uroscopy flasks for inspecting urine, and their astrological charts, were powerless. Their treatments failed. They died just as readily as their patients. The great Guy de Chauliac, personal physician to Pope Clement VI in Avignon, was one of the most famous and respected doctors in Europe. He contracted the plague himself and survived, he claimed, by treating himself with his own methods. But he was a notable exception. He wrote with brutal honesty about the plague's effect on his profession, a great mortality, ... so great that it left hardly a fourth part of the people, and it was ... shameful for the doctors that they did not dare to visit the sick for fear of being infected, and when they did visit, they did nothing and brought no healing. This catastrophic failure shattered public confidence in the medical profession. People began to turn away from the university-trained doctors and their painful, useless treatments. They turned instead to folk healers, to sellers of magical charms and amulets, and above all to God. The failure of medicine was a key factor in the overwhelming religious response to the plague. But it was also a failure that, in the long run, contained the seeds of progress. The utter inadequacy of classical medicine in the face of the plague demonstrated that the ancient texts were not infallible. It forced a new generation of doctors to begin, slowly and tentatively, to trust the evidence of their own eyes over the received wisdom of the past. The Black Death exposed a profound ignorance at the heart of medieval medicine, and in doing so created the vacuum that would eventually be filled by observation, experimentation, and the birth of modern science. But for the people of 14th century Europe, this was no comfort. Their healers had failed them, and society itself was beginning to come apart at the seams. A civilization is not merely a collection of people and buildings. It is a complex web of connections. a set of shared rules, rituals, and obligations that bind individuals together into a coherent whole. It is the trust between neighbors, the love within a family, the authority of the law, the sanctity of religious rites, and the dignity afforded to the dead. The Black Death did not just kill people. It systematically attacked and dissolved this connective tissue. As the plague tightened its grip on Europe, the sheer scale of death and the primal fear of contagion caused the very fabric of society to unravel, leaving behind a world where the fundamental bonds of human community had been severed. The most powerful and intimate account of this social collapse comes from the city of Florence, one of the wealthiest and most culturally vibrant centers of the 14th century. The writer Giovanni Boccaccio lived through the plague that struck his city in 1348 and immortalized its effects in the introduction to his famed work, the Decameron. His description is not a dry chronicle of death tolls, but a devastating psychological portrait of a society in freefall. He writes not as a historian, but as a traumatized eyewitness. The first and most sacred bond to break was that of the family. The terror of the Pneumonic, person-to-person spread of the disease transformed the most natural human affections into mortal threats. Boccaccio describes the horror with chilling clarity. Such terror was struck into the hearts of men and women by this calamity that brother abandoned brother, uncle his nephew, sister her brother, and in many cases wife her husband. But what is even more dreadful, is that fathers and mothers refused to nurse and assist their own children as though they were not theirs. An act of compassion tending to a sick child, spouse, or parent became an act of suicide. The instinct for self-preservation at its most raw and primal overwhelmed the duties of love and kinship. Homes, once sanctuaries of family life, became places of agonizing isolation, where the sick were walled up with their affliction, left to die alone. This abandonment radiated outwards from the family to the wider community. The bonds of neighborhood and friendship, the casual interactions that formed the bedrock of civil life, evaporated. People avoided all contact with one another. Boccaccio notes that people shunned every person and kept out of all places where sickness might be found. They would walk on opposite sides of the street, refusing to speak to or even make eye contact with their acquaintances, for fear that even a person's breath could carry the poison. Homes of the sick were marked and shunned. If a person died in a house, no one would dare to enter it again, leaving it to fall into ruin. This profound social distancing was not an organized public health measure. It was a spontaneous, fear-driven atomization of society, where every other human being became a potential source of death. As society atomized, its essential functions began to cease. The machinery of law and order ground to a halt. Boccaccio wrote, "In the face of so much affliction and misery, all respect for the laws of God and man had virtually broken down and been extinguished in our city. Many officials, notaries, judges, and guards were either dead or had fled to the countryside. Those who remained were often too terrified to enforce the law or perform their duties. Notaries, essential for the legal transfer of property and the recording of last wills and testaments, refused to enter the homes of the dying. This had profound consequences in a society so concerned with inheritance and the proper disposal of one's estate. The inability to make a legal will added a layer of spiritual and material chaos to the biological crisis, as families lost their inheritances and the dying were denied the comfort of putting their affairs in order. Perhaps the most visceral sign of societal collapse was the breakdown of the rituals surrounding death itself. In Christian Europe, the proper treatment of the dead was a matter of supreme importance. It was a sacred duty, essential for the salvation of the deceased's soul and the comfort of the living. A proper death involved receiving the last rites from a priest, being mourned by one's family, and being buried in consecrated ground with a full funeral mass. The plague made a mockery of all of this. Priests, who were called to the bedsides of the dying to hear confession and administer last rites, were exposed to the disease at a terrifying rate. Many died, and many more, out of fear, refused to attend to their flock. The sick were thus denied the final, essential comforts of their faith. The tradition of friends and neighbors gathering at the home of the deceased to mourn and accompany the body to the church vanished. No one dared to gather. Instead of a solemn procession, the disposal of the dead became a crude and hurried affair. Boccaccio describes how the deceased would be left in their homes until the stench became unbearable. Then hired porters, known as bacchini, often criminals, or men hardened by poverty, would come, hoist the body onto a bier, and cart it away with little ceremony. The sheer number of the dead overwhelmed the city's graveyards. The churchyards were filled within weeks. Consecrated ground became a scarce commodity. The solution was as grim as it was necessary: the mass grave or plague pit. Outside the city walls, enormous trenches were dug. The bacchini would arrive with their carts, laden with corpses, and simply tip them into the pits. Boccaccio paints a haunting picture. They were laid in layers in the trenches, like goods stowed in the hold of a ship. A thin layer of earth would be shoveled over them, and the next layer of bodies would be added on top. The individual was lost. There were no names, no markers, no personal farewells. The dignity of death, a cornerstone of the civilization, was gone, replaced by the grim logistics of waste disposal. This collapse was not unique to Florence. It was repeated in cities and towns across the continent. In London, the single churchyard of St. Mary Spital was quickly overwhelmed, and a new emergency cemetery was established on land purchased by Sir Walter Manny, where it is believed tens of thousands were buried in layered pits. In Avignon, the papal city, the Rhone River itself was consecrated by the Pope so that bodies could be thrown into it for burial. The normal rhythms of economic life also disintegrated, with farmers and peasants dying in the fields, crops rotted unharvested. With artisans and craftsmen dying in the cities, workshops fell silent. Trade ground to a halt as cities closed their gates to outsiders and merchants refused to travel. The world became a fragmented landscape of isolated, terrified communities, each fighting its own losing battle against the pestilence. The psychological impact of this unraveling was immense and lasting. It produced a spectrum of reactions. Some, like the characters in Boccaccio's Decameron, fled to the countryside to form small, isolated communes, trying to wait out the plague in a bubble of pleasure and storytelling, deliberately shutting out the horror. Others rushed in the opposite direction into a state of licentious abandon, believing the end of the world was at hand and that death was inevitable. They gave themselves over to drink and debauchery, wandering from tavern to tavern, seizing the property of the dead and living only for the moment. The most common reaction, however, was a pervasive and paralyzing fear. It was a fear that hollowed out society from the inside, leaving behind only the shell of a civilization. In a world where one could no longer trust one's family, one's neighbors, or the institutions of church and state, there was nothing left to hold on to. And in this vacuum of order and explanation, a darker, more ancient human impulse began to stir, the need to find someone to blame. When faced with a catastrophe of incomprehensible scale, one that defies all known laws of medicine, nature, and God, the human mind desperately seeks a cause. When the cause is an invisible bacterium, an enemy that cannot be seen or understood, that desperation can curdle into a dark and poisonous paranoia. For many in Christian Europe, the explanation that the plague was a punishment from God for their sins was not enough. The suffering was too random, too total. There had to be a more direct, more malevolent agent at work. There had to be a conspiracy. There had to be a human face to blame for the apocalypse. And in the long and tragic history of Europe, there was one community that had been repeatedly and unjustly forced to play this role: the Jews. Anti-Semitism was a deeply rooted poison in 14th century European society. For centuries, Jews had been cast as the other within Christendom, confined to ghettos, barred from owning land or joining guilds, and often forced into the profession of money lending, abkaufen, practice forbidden to Christians but essential for the economy. They were a visible and vulnerable minority. They were subject to a host of slanderous myths, from the blood libel that accused them of murdering Christian children to the charge of host desecration. Most damningly, they were collectively and falsely blamed for the death of Jesus Christ. This long-standing religious and economic resentment created a fertile ground for the most horrific conspiracy theory of the Black Death dot. As the plague swept across Europe, a new and deadly rumor began to spread, moving along the same trade routes as the disease itself. The rumor claimed that the pestilence was not a natural event at all, but a deliberate act of mass murder orchestrated by international jury. The story, which varied in its details from town to town, alleged that Jewish leaders had met in secret and devised a plan to destroy Christendom by poisoning the wells, springs, and rivers from which Christians drew their water. The poison, it was said, was a powder made from a hideous mixture of consecrated hosts, spiders, frogs, and the hearts of Christians. This vile concoction was then distributed to local Jews throughout Europe, who were instructed to secretly deposit it in their town's water supplies. It was a theory that was as ludicrous as it was evil, yet in the atmosphere of extreme terror and ignorance it found a receptive audience. It offered a simple, satisfying explanation for an unbearable reality. It provided a tangible enemy that could be confronted and destroyed, and it offered a perverse kind of hope. If the poisoners could be eliminated, perhaps the plague would cease. The persecution began in the south of France in the spring of 1348. At a castle in Chillon, on the shores of Lake Geneva, a number of local Jews were arrested and subjected to horrific torture. Unsurprisingly, they confessed. The coerced confession of a Jewish doctor named Balavignus was widely circulated, serving as proof of the conspiracy. He described under duress the recipe for the poison and the network of rabbis who had distributed it. This confession, extracted through unimaginable pain, lit the fuse of a continent-wide wave of violence. From Switzerland and Savoy, the massacres spread northward into the prosperous towns of the Rhineland in Germany, a region with a large and well-established Jewish population. The pattern of violence was terrifyingly consistent. The local population, often led by the town's guilds of craftsmen or by mobs of flagellants, would rise up, demanding the death of the town's Jews. In some cases, the local lords or city councils, who often had a financial interest in protecting their Jewish communities, would try to intervene, but they were frequently overwhelmed by the sheer fury of the mob. The stories from these pogroms are a litany of horror. In Basel, Switzerland, the city's several hundred Jews were rounded up, locked inside a specially constructed wooden building on an island in the Rhine, and burned alive in January 1349. In the imperial city of Strasbourg, the situation was particularly tragic. The city council and the mayor, Hans von Winterthur, were determined to protect their Jewish citizens, recognizing the absurdity of the well-poisoning accusations. But the town's powerful guilds, resentful of the council's power and indebted to Jewish moneylenders, saw an opportunity. They inflamed the public, overthrew the city government in a violent coup, and arrested the mayor. On St. Valentine's Day, 1349, the new council brought the city's entire Jewish population, some 2,000 men, women, and children, to the Jewish cemetery. Those who agreed to be baptized were spared. The rest, around 900 people, were forced onto a massive wooden platform that had been erected, and it was set on fire. It was reported that the plague had not even reached Strasbourg at the time of the massacre. In the great Rhineland cities of Cologne, Mainz, and Worms, ancient Jewish communities that dated back to the Roman Empire, were entirely annihilated. In Mainz, the Jewish community, facing certain death, chose to fight back. They armed themselves and managed to kill some 200 members of the attacking mob before they were finally overpowered and slaughtered. In many of these towns, rather than face the fury of the mob and forced conversion, entire Jewish communities chose to take their own lives in an act of mass martyrdom, a practice known as Kiddush Hashem, or sanctification of the name. They would set fire to their own homes and synagogues, dying in the flames rather than fall into the hands of their persecutors. It is crucial to note that not everyone was swept up in this hysteria. The highest authority in Christendom, Pope Clement VI, residing in Avignon, was a man of reason and relative tolerance. He issued 2 papal bulls in 1348 that fiercely condemned the violence. He stated flatly that the Jews were not responsible for the plague, pointing out the logical flaw in the accusation. The plague was killing Jews just as readily as it was killing Christians. He wrote that those who blamed the Jews were seduced by that liar, the devil. He threatened anyone who harmed or forcibly converted a Jew with excommunication. He even offered personal protection to the Jews of Avignon, sheltering them within the papal palace. But the authority of the Pope, while immense, was not absolute. In the German-speaking lands, his decrees were widely ignored, dismissed as evidence that he too had been bribed by Jewish gold. The voice of reason was drowned out by the roar of the mob. The motivations behind the pogroms were a toxic brew of religious fanaticism, deep-seated prejudice, and cold, hard economics. The massacres were often followed by the official cancellation of all debts owed to the murdered Jews. The property of the victims was seized and divided among the citizens, the guilds, and the local lords. The persecution was not just an act of passion. For many, it was an opportunity for financial gain and the erasure of inconvenient obligations docked by the time the wave of violence subsided in 1351. It had left a scar of almost unimaginable proportions. Over 350 Jewish communities in Europe had been attacked, and more than 200 had been completely wiped from existence. The great Jewish centers of the Rhineland were gone. The survivors fled eastward, seeking refuge in Poland and Lithuania, where the rulers offered them protection. This mass migration would permanently reshape the demography of European Jewry, establishing Eastern Europe as its new heartland for centuries to come. The scapegoating of the Jews during the Black Death stands as one of history's most stark and terrible examples of how pandemics can act as an accelerant for hatred, providing a pretext for the violent expression of pre-existing bigotries. It was a moral plague that raged alongside the biological one, and its legacy of violence and intolerance would haunt the continent for centuries to come. When the first and most violent wave of the Black Death began to recede around 1351, the survivors emerged into a world that was eerily quiet. They were alive, but they were living in a land of ghosts. It is estimated that in the space of less than 5 years, between a third and a half of Europe's entire population had perished. In some regions, the toll was even higher, with villages and towns losing 60, 70, or even 80% of their people. This demographic collapse, the greatest single loss of life in recorded history, was a human tragedy of almost incomprehensible scale. But it also unintentionally set in motion a series of profound and revolutionary economic changes. The plague, in its grim and arbitrary reaping, had completely upended the fundamental laws of the medieval economy. In doing so, it dealt a fatal blow to the ancient system of feudalism and planted the seeds of a new, more modern economic order. The medieval economy was built on a single, crucial foundation, a vast and cheap supply of human labor. For centuries, the population of Europe had been growing, creating a huge pool of peasants and serfs who worked the land for the benefit of a small land-owning elite of lords and clergy. The system was static and hierarchical. A serf was tied to the land of his lord. He was not free to leave, and his labor was not his own to sell. He owed his lord a certain number of days of work each year, as well as a portion of his own harvest, in exchange for his small plot of land and a promise of protection. In this world of abundant labor and scarce land, the power was entirely in the hands of the landowners. Wages for free laborers were pitifully low, and the peasant had no leverage. Black Death shattered this reality. By wiping out up to half of the workforce, it radically inverted the old equation. Suddenly land was plentiful, and labor was scarce. This was a concept so alien to the medieval mindset that it took time for its implications to be understood. The immediate aftermath of the plague was chaos. Across the continent, fields lay fallow. Crops rotted in the ground for lack of anyone to harvest them, and entire villages were simply abandoned, their homes left empty to be reclaimed by nature. Livestock wandered untended. Mines flooded and workshops closed their doors. The machinery of production had ground to a halt. But as the initial shock wore off, a new reality began to assert itself. For the first time in centuries, the surviving members of the Third Estate, the common laborers, peasants, and artisans, found themselves in a position of unprecedented power. A lord with a vast estate now found he had only a handful of peasants left to work it. A master craftsman with a backlog of orders might be the only one of his trade left in an entire town. The survivors were in demand, and for the first time, they could make demands of their own. The most immediate and dramatic effect was on wages. Peasants who had once worked for subsistence now found that neighboring lords, desperate for workers, were willing to outbid each other for their services. They began to demand and receive dramatically higher wages for their labor. The price of labor skyrocketed. In England, for example, historical records showed that the daily wage for a master carpenter nearly doubled in the years following the plague. A reaper who might have earned 2 pence a day before the plague could now demand 8 pence plus a midday meal. This was not just a pay raise, it was a revolution in the value of human work. This new economic power translated into new social freedoms. The rigid bonds of serfdom began to dissolve. A serf tied to a particular manor could now simply walk away, confident that another lord down the road would gladly accept him as a free tenant farmer, no questions asked, and pay him handsomely for his labor. The old system of feudal obligation was being replaced by a new system of cash-based contracts. Landowners, unable to force people to work for them, had to entice them instead. They began to abandon the old model of demesne farming, working a large private estate with serf labor, and instead started leasing out their land to free tenants for fixed cash rents. For the peasant, this was a momentous change. It gave them autonomy, mobility, and a direct stake in their own prosperity. The ruling classes, the nobility, and the wealthy church landowners watched this turn of events with alarm and outrage. Their world was being turned upside axle-turvy. They saw the rising confidence and demands of the peasantry not as a natural economic consequence, but as an affront to the God-given social order. They saw peasants demanding higher pay, dressing in finer clothes previously reserved for the nobility, and refusing to show the proper deference. In response, they used their power over the machinery of the state to try and force the clock back. Across Europe, governments enacted legislation designed to suppress the new power of labor. The most famous of these was the English Statute of Laborers, passed in 1351. This law made it illegal for employers to pay, or for workers to accept, wages that were higher than the pre-plague levels of 1346. It decreed that every able-bodied man and woman under the age of 60 must work for anyone who required it, and it forbade laborers from leaving their parish in search of better-paid employment. Similar laws were passed in France, Spain, and other kingdoms. These laws were, in essence, an attempt by the elite to legislate feudalism back into existence. But they were a spectacular failure. The economic laws of supply and demand proved far more powerful than the laws of kings and parliaments. The wage controls were almost impossible to enforce. In a landscape starved for labor, both employers and Employees had a vested interest in ignoring the law. Lords would quietly offer illegal wages to attract workers, and workers would gladly accept them. While some were punished, the system was simply unworkable on a large scale. The primary effect of these laws was not to suppress wages, but to breed enormous resentment among the common people. They saw the statutes for what they were, an attempt by the rich and powerful to steal the one benefit that the horrific trauma of the plague had bestowed upon them. This simmering resentment would boil over into open rebellion in the decades that followed. The most famous example was the English peasants' revolt of 1381, fueled by years of frustration over the statute of laborers and the imposition of a new poll tax. A massive army of peasants and artisans from the southeast of England marched on London, demanding an end to serfdom, the repeal of the labor laws, and the removal of corrupt officials. While the revolt was ultimately crushed with great brutality, it was a terrifying demonstration of the new consciousness and power of the common people. The old deference was gone, replaced by a defiant belief in their own rights and worth. The Black Death, therefore, acted as a fierce and brutal agent of economic, creative destruction. It cleared away the centuries-old, stagnant system of feudalism and manorialism. It empowered a new class of free, wage-earning laborers and tenant farmers. It led to greater social mobility and a gradual redistribution of wealth from the landed aristocracy to the working population. It was a painful and bloody transition, but it laid the essential groundwork for the development of a more dynamic, more individualistic, and ultimately more capitalist European economy. The world that emerged from the plague was one where the value of a single human life and the value of a single day's work had been forever and irrevocably changed. In a world without a scientific understanding of disease, in an age where the divine was not a matter of belief but of palpable fact, there was only one truly comprehensible explanation for the horror of the Black Death. It was the wrath of God. The pestilence was a divine punishment on a global scale, a biblical scourge visited upon a world that had become mired in sin, vanity, and corruption. This overwhelming consensus shaped the primary response to the plague, which was not medical or civic, but spiritual. Faced with what appeared to be the literal end of days, the people of Europe turned to their faith with a desperate, all-consuming intensity. This turn produced astonishing acts of piety and devotion, but it also unleashed some of the most bizarre and terrifying displays of religious fanaticism in European history. The initial reaction was a massive surge in conventional religious observance. The churches, which had so often been shunned in favor of the tavern or the marketplace, were suddenly filled to overflowing. People flocked to hear Mass, to pray for deliverance, and to confess their sins, hoping to purify their souls before the pestilence claimed their bodies. Donations to the church, particularly from the wealthy who were desperate to buy their way into God's favor, skyrocketed. The demand for private masses and prayers for the dead became so great that the surviving clergy were overwhelmed. New religious endowments were founded and new chapels were built, all dedicated to appeasing an angry God. This upwelling of piety also saw the rise of new cults of saints. People sought heavenly intercessors who could plead their case before the divine throne. The traditional patrons of healing seemed powerless. so people turned to saints associated with suffering and sudden death. The most prominent of these was Saint Sebastian, an early Christian martyr, who was said to have been shot with arrows. The association with the random, piercing nature of the plague made him a natural protector. Paintings and altarpieces of Saint Sebastian, his body pierced with arrows, proliferated across Europe. An even more popular figure was Saint Roch, a 14th century pilgrim from Montpellier, who, according to legend, had been struck by the plague but was miraculously cured after. Retreating to the wilderness, he was often depicted as a pilgrim, pointing to a single plague bubo on his thigh, making him the ultimate symbol of hope and survival. These plague saints became superstars of the celestial court, their shrines attracting desperate pilgrims, and their names invoked in countless prayers. Public displays of piety became commonplace. Town councils and religious guilds organized huge, solemn processions. Thousands of people would march barefoot through the streets, fasting and praying, carrying crosses, holy relics, and banners of the Virgin Mary or their local patron saint. They would snake their way from one church to another, chanting litanies and begging God for mercy. While intended as an act of humble supplication, these large public gatherings, which brought together huge numbers of people in close contact, almost certainly served as super-spreading events, contributing to the very devastation they were meant to avert. For some, however, these conventional displays of piety were not enough. The scale of God's wrath, they believed, demanded a more extreme, more dramatic act of penance. If humanity's sins had caused this apocalypse, then humanity must offer a sacrifice of its own flesh to atone for them. This belief gave birth to the most extraordinary and disturbing religious movement of the Black Death, the Flagellants. The flagellant movement first appeared in Germany in 1349 and spread with incredible speed. They were organized groups of lay people, mostly men but sometimes including women, who journeyed from town to town in a ritual of public self-inflicted punishment. Their arrival in a town was a piece of high drama. They would march in disciplined columns, 2 by 2, wearing white robes marked with a red cross on the front and back, their faces and heads often covered by hoods. They carried no possessions except for their terrible instrument of penance, the scourge. This was a whip with a wooden handle and 3 or 4 leather thongs, each embedded with sharp pieces of iron. Upon reaching a town's main square or churchyard, their ritual would begin. They would form a large circle, and at the direction of their leader or master, they would begin to chant and sing hymns. Then they would strip to the waist and begin to whip themselves. They would scourge their own backs and chests, the iron tips tearing their flesh until they were covered in blood. As they whipped themselves, they would prostrate themselves on the ground in the shape of a cross, praying for the sins of the world. The ceremony was a highly theatrical public performance of suffering, designed to be so shocking that it would move God to mercy. The sight of hundreds of men, covered in blood, crying out in unison, was both terrifying and mesmerizing to the local populace, who would gather in the thousands to watch, many weeping and praying along with them. Initially, the flagellants were welcomed as heroes of faith, holy men whose extreme penance might save everyone. But their movement quickly grew more radical and began to challenge the authority of the Church itself. Their leaders claimed to have a direct line to God, asserting that their movement would last for 33.5 years, mirroring the length of Christ's life on earth. They claimed that their rituals were more powerful than the sacraments of the Church. They began to usurp the role of priests, hearing confessions and granting absolution. They interrupted church services, drove priests from their altars, and claimed that a letter had fallen from heaven, written by an angel, which sanctioned their movement and promised that anyone who saw them perform their ritual would be saved. Their radicalism also took a violent turn. The flagellant processions were often the catalysts for the horrific Jewish pogroms. As they marched through the Rhineland, their apocalyptic fervor and search for sinners on whom to blame the plague often focused on the local Jewish communities, whom they accused of being in league with the devil. The arrival of the flagellants in a town was frequently the signal for a massacre to begin. This combination of heretical teachings and violent incitement finally turned the established church against them. In October 1349, Pope Clement VI, who had once been cautiously tolerant of the movement, issued a papal bull condemning the flagellants. He denounced them as a heretical sect, operating without the sanction of the Church, spreading false teachings, and inciting murder. He ordered all clerical and secular authorities to suppress them. Faced with the combined opposition of the Pope and the ruling elite, the movement was crushed. Its leaders were arrested and executed, and its followers scattered. The flagellant phenomenon burned brightly and terribly for less than a year, but it left behind a deep scar, a testament to the extremes of terror and faith that the plague had unleashed. The Black Death was a profound crisis for the institution of the Catholic Church. On one hand, it drove people to the faith in unprecedented numbers. On the other, the Church's manifest inability to stop the plague, or even explain it coherently beyond God's will, shook the foundations of its authority. When priests died as easily as peasants, when prayers and processions seemed to have no effect, it created a quiet but pervasive crisis of confidence. For some, this led to a deeper, more personal form of piety, one less reliant on the formal institution of the Church. For others, it planted the first seeds of doubt and anti-clericalism that would eventually blossom a century and a half later in the Protestant Reformation. The spiritual landscape of Europe, like its economic and social landscapes, was being irrevocably reshaped by the pestilence. In the overwhelming darkness of the Black Death, amidst the litany of death, despair, and destruction, it is easy to assume that Europe was a continent simply waiting to die. It is easy to forget that at every moment people were fighting back. They were not passive victims. They were thinking, adapting, and innovating, driven by the most powerful human instinct, the will to survive. While the grand theories of academic medicine failed and the heavens seemed silent, survival often came, down to practicality, observation, and courage. These are the stories of how, in the crucible of the plague, humanity began to lay the foundations for a new concept of public health and demonstrated a resilience that would ensure its ultimate, if costly, survival. Not everyone who was exposed to Yersinia pestis died. A portion of the population, perhaps those who had been exposed to a less virulent strain or had a smaller initial dose of bacteria, or perhaps those who were simply lucky enough to possess a more robust immune system, managed to fight off the infection and recover. The psychological impact on these survivors was profound. They had stared death in the face and won. Guy de Chauliac, the Pope's physician, described his own 6-week-long battle with the plague as a period of continuous fever and suffering, but he endured. Such survivors became living symbols of hope, though they were often shunned as people feared they could still carry the disease. More recently, geneticists have even proposed that the Black Death acted as a powerful agent of natural selection, favoring individuals who possessed a specific genetic mutation known as CCR5 delta 32, which, while not primarily for plague, may have conferred some small advantage in surviving bacterial infections. The simplest story of survival, then, is one of pure biological chance, but survival was not just a matter of luck or genetics. It was also a matter of action, and the most effective action was avoidance. Those with the means and foresight to do so fled the crowded, pestilential cities for the relative safety of the countryside. The most famous example, immortalized by Boccaccio, is a group of 7 young women and 3 young men who retreat to a secluded villa in the hills outside Florence to wait out the plague, telling stories to pass the time. This was a strategy for the wealthy, but even on a larger scale, isolation proved effective. The city of Nuremberg, for example, took decisive action early on, strictly controlling all traffic in and out of its walls. Its death rate was significantly lower than that of other major German cities. The Kingdom of Poland and the city of Milan are 2 other famous, if somewhat debated, examples of regions that seem to suffer less than their neighbors. In Milan, the authorities reportedly resorted to the brutal but effective measure of immediately walling up any house in which a case of plague was discovered, sealing the sick and the healthy inside together to die. It was a horrifying sacrifice of the few to save the many, but it appeared to have slowed the contagion within the city. These were reactive measures, born of desperation. But the true leap forward, the birth of a revolutionary idea in public health, came from observing the patterns of the plague's arrival. Thoughtful officials in several port cities began to notice a clear connection. The pestilence almost always arrived by ship. This observation, simple as it sounds, was a monumental step away from theories of miasma or divine punishment, and towards a modern understanding of contagion. It suggested that the disease was not just in the air, but was something that could be carried by people and goods. And if it could be carried, it could be stopped at the border. The city-state that pioneered this new approach was not one of the great powers like Venice or Genoa, but the smaller, canny maritime republic of Ragusa, modern-day Dubrovnik, on the coast of Croatia. In 1377, with the plague still returning in recurring waves, the city's council passed a revolutionary law. They decreed that all ships and people arriving from plague-infected areas would not be allowed to enter the city immediately. Instead, they would be required to go to a nearby island and remain there in isolation for a period of 30 days to see if the disease would develop. This waiting period was called a Trentino, from the Italian word for 30. This was the world's first organized, state-mandated quarantine. The Ragusians soon found that 30 days was not quite long enough and extended the period to 40 days. This new 40-day period was called a quarantino, from the Italian for 40. This is the direct origin of our modern word and practice of quarantine. It was a public health measure based not on superstition, but on empirical observation. It was a tacit admission that they did not know exactly what was causing the disease, but they knew it had an incubation period, and they could use that knowledge to protect their citizens. Following Ragusa's lead, other port cities like Venice began to adopt and refine the system. Venice established the first dedicated quarantine station, or lazaretto, on an island in its lagoon in 1423, a specialized hospital for holding and treating not just plague victims but all suspected arrivals. These measures were the very beginning of the science of epidemiology and the practice of preventative public health. Beyond these large-scale state actions, there were countless unrecorded stories of individual and community survival. These were acts of quiet courage and common sense. They were the families who barricaded themselves in their homes, refusing entry to anyone. They were the monasteries that shut their gates and survived through self-sufficiency. They were the individuals who, whether through instinct or observation, practiced a level of hygiene far above the norm. The Jewish communities, for all they were persecuted, often had lower death rates. This was once used as proof of their guilt, but historians now suggest a simpler reason. Jewish religious laws mandated a higher degree of personal cleanliness, including the washing of hands before meals and after funerals, which may have offered a small but significant degree of protection. Even in the midst of the horror, there were those who upheld their duty and their humanity. While Boccaccio wrote of parents abandoning children, it is certain that for every case of abandonment, there were thousands of unrecorded cases of parents who stayed and nursed their children to the end. For every priest who fled, there was another who remained, offering last rites until he too succumbed. There were the physicians like Guy de Chauliac who, despite the failure of their methods, remained at their posts out of a sense of professional duty. There were the anonymous gravediggers, the Bacchini, who, while often reviled, performed an essential and uniquely hazardous public service, risking their lives daily to clear the streets of the dead and prevent an even worse sanitary crisis. Story of survival during the Black Death is not a story of a single heroic breakthrough or a magic cure. It is a story of a scattered, desperate, and multifaceted defense. It is a story of luck, of genetics, of brutal but effective isolation, and of the slow dawning light of rational observation. It is a story found in the resilience of the human body, the ingenuity of the human mind, and the stubborn persistence of the human spirit. Humanity did not conquer the plague, not in the 14th century, but it endured it, and in the process of enduring it learned the first crucial lessons that would one day allow it to fight back effectively against the invisible enemies that have always haunted our world. The survivors and the children of the survivors would go on to build a new world on the ashes of the old, a world forever marked by the long shadow of the great mortality. The Great Fire of the Black Death, which had raged across Europe from 1347 to 1351, eventually burned itself out. The pestilence did not vanish, but it receded into the background, having consumed so much of its fuel that it could no longer sustain a continent-wide pandemic. The survivors stepped out into a world that was profoundly and irrevocably changed. It was a world half empty, a landscape of silent villages and overgrown fields. But it was also a world where the old certainties, the rigid structures of society, the unquestioned authority of the church, the very relationship between humanity and God had been shaken to their core. The Black Death was over, but its long shadow would stretch for centuries, and in that shadow the modern world would begin to take shape. The most immediate legacy was psychological. An entire generation had been traumatized, living through an apocalypse that had carried away their parents, their children, and their neighbors. This proximity to sudden, arbitrary death created a new, darker sensibility in European culture. The art of the late Middle Ages became obsessed with mortality. A new artistic genre, the danse macabre, or dance of death, appeared in murals and woodcuts across the continent. In these images, skeletal figures representing death are shown leading people from all walks of lifeboats, kings, knights, peasants, and children, in a grim dance to their graves. The message was stark and democratic. Death comes for everyone, regardless of wealth or status. Another popular motif was the triumph of death, which depicted death as a skeletal figure riding a pale horse or driving a cart, scything down the living indiscriminately. This was not the art of a confident, secure civilization. It was the art of a society deeply scarred by loss and haunted by the fragility of life. This psychological shift had a complex effect. While it produced a culture of morbid reflection, it also, paradoxically, may have contributed to a new appreciation for life in the here and now. With the promise of a long life so uncertain, and the afterlife so vividly and terrifyingly imagined, there was a new impetus to find meaning and even pleasure in the earthly world. This nascent humanism, this focus on human experience and potential, would become one of the key intellectual currents of the coming Renaissance. The plague's demographic shadow was long and deep. The disease did not disappear after 1351. It became endemic, returning in smaller, more localized but still deadly outbreaks every 10 to 20 years for the next 3 centuries. These recurring waves meant that the population of Europe did not begin to recover to its pre-plague levels until well into the 16th or even 17th century. This long-term population stagnation continued to fuel the economic and social transformations that had begun during the first outbreak. The scarcity of labor and the high value of the individual worker became a permanent feature of the European economy for generations, cementing the decline of serfdom and accelerating the rise of a wage-based, market-driven society. The plagues. Shadow also fell heavily across the political and religious landscape. The massive loss of life amongst the clergy and the church's inability to provide either protection or solace had permanently weakened its institutional prestige. The wave of anti-clerical sentiment and the rise of personal, mystical forms of piety that had begun during the plague continued to grow. The questioning of papal authority and the critiques of a wealthy, land-owning church laid the intellectual groundwork for the critiques that would be leveled by reformers like John Wycliffe and Jan Hus in the coming decades, and ultimately by Martin Luther in the 16th century. The Black Death did not directly cause the Protestant Reformation, but it created the cracks in the edifice of Catholic unity that would later be shattered in a strange way. The plague may have even contributed to the flourishing of knowledge that characterized the Renaissance. The massive death toll among the old, Tradition-bound scholars in the universities created opportunities for new thinkers with new ideas. The drastic shortage of scribes and clergy, who were the primary producers of books, created a demand for new, faster ways to reproduce texts, a pressure that would ultimately contribute to the invention of the printing press. And the wholesale abandonment of old landholdings allowed a new class of people to consolidate property, creating new fortunes that would be used to patronize the great artists and thinkers of the 5th, 10th, and 16th centuries. The Black Death was, therefore, more than a tragedy. It was a historical singularity, a great reset button that was brutally and indiscriminately pressed on the European continent. It acted as a terrifying and powerful catalyst for change, accelerating processes that were already underway and initiating new ones that would have been unthinkable in the world of 1346. It cleared away the dense, overgrown forest of the High Middle Ages with its rigid hierarchies and seemingly eternal structures, and in the cleared space it allowed new and different kinds of growth to take root. The road from the Black Death to the Renaissance and the modern world was not a straight or simple one, but it is impossible to understand the world that came after without understanding the profound rupture that the plague created. Looking back, from our modern vantage point, the story of the Black Death remains one of history's most potent and sobering lessons. It is a stark reminder of the power of the natural world and of our own vulnerability within it. It shows how a microscopic organism, riding on the unseen networks of global trade, can bring the proudest of civilizations to its knees. It reveals the terrifying speed with which social order can collapse in the face of fear and the ace of fear, and the impetus, grotesque ways in which crisis can be exploited to fuel hatred and violence. But it is also a story that contains the seeds of our own triumphs. It is in the response to the plague that we see the first glimmers of modern public health, the first tentative steps towards a medicine based on observation, and a profound testament to the resilience of those who survived and rebuilt their shattered world. The long shadow of the plague is a shadow of death, but it is also the shadow in which the modern world was born. The world that emerged from the shadow of the Black Death was a quieter, emptier, and more somber place. The silence in the fields, the abandoned homes in the villages, the vast, freshly dug plague pits on the outskirts of every city, these were the monuments to a loss so profound it could scarcely be articulated. A third, perhaps even a half, of Europe's people were gone. An entire civilization had looked into the abyss, and the abyss had stared back. In our journey today, we have traced the path of Yersinia pestis from the remote steppes of Asia to the heart of Christendom. We have witnessed the failure of medieval science, the crumbling of social bonds, and the desperate search for meaning in the face of an invisible, indiscriminate killer. We have seen the worst of humanity in the scapegoating of the innocent, and the seeds of our best instincts in the first attempts at quarantine and public health. The Black Death was more than just a demographic catastrophe. It was a great unraveling. It pulled at every thread of the medieval tapestry until the entire picture was changed. The rigid pyramid of feudalism, already under strain, was irrevocably broken by the new value of labor. The absolute authority of the Church was shaken by its inability to explain, prevent, or cure the pestilence, planting seeds of doubt that would blossom in the Reformation. A new, darker awareness of mortality entered the European consciousness. But from that darkness, paradoxically, came a renewed focus on the value of human life here on Earth, a humanism that would fuel the fires of the Renaissance. The world was remade by a bacterium. This is, perhaps, the most humbling lesson of the great mortality. It reminds us that for all our power, for all our technology and ambition, human history is inextricably linked to the natural world, to the vast invisible ecosystems of which we are only one part. The Black Death was a historical singularity, a brutal and decisive turning point, but its echoes are a timeless warning. They remind us of our vulnerability, of the thin veneer of order that separates our world from chaos, and of the terror that can arise when fear and ignorance eclipse reason and compassion. Yet, it is also, in the end, a story of survival. Humanity endured. The world did not end. The survivors, forever changed, picked up the pieces and began to build a new world on the bones of the old. They learned, they adapted, and they carried on, bequeathing to us a world shaped in countless ways by their suffering. The long shadow of the plague serves as a stark testament to the fragility of life, but also to the unyielding resilience of the human spirit. Thank you for joining us on this journey into one of history's most devastating chapters.